Ryan, tell me, you're there, what you're seeing, what it feels like as this fight reaches its climax.
Well, Chris, I'm not inside the Capitol yet. Thank you for bearing with me on what's been a hectic week. For all week, it has felt very tense here. In fact, just yesterday, we saw an evacuation at the Texas Capitol after a threat to law enforcement and lawmakers' lives. The Department of Public Safety says that a social media threat told people to go to the Capitol and shoot anybody who was guarding the House chamber. This all came from the controversy around Representative Nicole Collier detained inside the House chamber. So they actually had to evacuate protesters, journalists, you just feel that the temperature around this issue is rising to a dangerous degree as this debate gets underway. A little bit of what to expect now that the Capitol is safe and they had determined that threat was not imminent. I talked to the Republican chairman of the House Administration Committee yesterday. He told me that the plan is to pass this bill on the House floor once and for all. That's going to take some parliamentary procedure changes, but they're going to rush this through the process and get it to the Senate as soon as possible. And then that will end the call on the House that is keeping members confined inside, Chris.
Ryan Chandler, I know you are trying very hard to make your way to the chamber. Hopefully we'll talk to you a little bit later on when you're able to get there and see firsthand what's happening. Appreciate it. Eddie, redistricting is not a new concept, right? The term gerrymandering has been around for something like 200 years. So why does this moment and this fight feel different, and is it different?
Well, I think it's an echo. First of all, it's great to see you, Chris. It's an echo of the past, but it's also a kind of reflection of the crisis that we find ourselves in. We cannot disentangle what's happening in Texas from Trump's demand that Texas find him 5 new seats. That's similar to the call to the Secretary of State in Georgia, right? So it's part of this process of undermining democratic norms that we feel in this moment. But we also need to see it as well as part of a broader strategy, I think, of really disenfranchising Black and brown voters, of dismantling, I think, the infrastructure of the civil rights movement and its legal infrastructure, I would say. And so, because think about it, Chris, 4.3 million Black people live in Texas, the largest number of Black folk in any state, in any country, in the union. And look at that districting map. How are their voices going to be represented? So I want us to understand what we're seeing not only in Texas, but around the country as a part of racial gerrymandering, as part of the racialist and racist agenda of the Trump administration. I know we want to talk about it simply in terms of politics, but there's something insidious underneath it all.
Well, since you brought it up, I want to give people, Eddie, a visual example of how maps like the ones in Texas dilute the strength of some voters, boost the strength of others. Just an example, 2024, President Trump beat Harris in Texas by 56 to 42%. 71% of voters in that district that backed Trump. Under these new maps, it would be an even greater advantage, 79%. Is that what a representative democracy should look like?
No, absolutely not. And part of what we're witnessing over and over again, right, is the dismantling of the basic foundations of our democratic process. And so I think we have to ring the alarm. We can't get caught up in the spectacle of it all. We have to understand the deliberate, the targeted, with precision ways in which these folk are acting. And what we're seeing in Texas, from the kidnapping of state representatives to having to sign permission slips to having highway patrol accompany legislators, all of this doesn't bode well for the state of our democracy. And it suggests how deeply, deeply troubling, right, the current racial politics of the country are.
Which makes Democrats have a really huge role in all of this, Michael. There's a lot of this that people could argue is performative. Oh, they left the state. They knew it wasn't going to change anything. Oh, they slept overnight in their chairs, just to make the point that you can't give us security guards to take us to and from our homes so you can check on where we are and what we're doing. So they've generated a lot of buzz. But have they accomplished something here?
Yes, that matters. Democratic voters want to see their electeds fight. So those Texas representatives have done the right thing. But let's take a step back. The world has changed. Donald Trump is saying 14 months outside of the midterm election that he's going to cheat and he's willing to do whatever it takes. And so Democrats have to respond in kind. What does that look like? What Gavin Newsom is doing in California, for instance. But that should happen across the country. Democrats shouldn't say, well, we never did this before in terms of doing this in the middle of the 10-year period, so we shouldn't do it now. Donald Trump is saying, I'm going to cheat. So Democrats have to do whatever it takes to make sure that we have a free and fair election in the midterms.
So, Rick, are there any legal avenues for either Texas lawmakers or Texas voters as obviously the path moves forward for what looks like approving these redistricting maps?
Fortunately, the Supreme Court has held that the federal courts have no power to stop partisan gerrymandering. I actually represented Common Cause before the Supreme Court in the case in which we were trying to push the court to impose constitutional constraints on partisan gerrymandering, but those don't exist under federal law. The Voting Rights Act is still the most important constraint that applies here. So the Texas maps cannot dilute the voting power of Hispanic or African-American voters in Texas. The situation with Hispanic voters in Texas, though, has actually become much more complicated and interesting because, as you know, in the presidential election, Latino voters were fairly evenly divided, Republican and Democratic. And one of the predicates for the Voting Rights Act to apply is that the minority community has to be politically cohesive. So if Hispanic voters are now more divided in partisan terms, it's unclear exactly how the Voting Rights Act would apply in Texas. It may apply in certain parts of the state and not others, but that would be the major legal constraint. I'm sure there will be Voting Rights Act challenges to this map once it's enacted.
Well, can I just stop you there? Because I think that number that Eddie put out there is really informative. 4.3 million blacks, more than in any other state in the union. Does that argue for the application of that?
Oh, there's no question that the Voting Rights Act protects black voters in Texas from having their voting power diluted in the way districts are drawn. Most of the litigation about districting in Texas has been about Hispanic voters because they are such a large portion of the community in Texas. But there's no question black voters are still politically cohesive in their voting patterns. So the Voting Rights Act, if there's vote dilution with respect to those voters, would certainly kick in. The cohesion of the Hispanic community has become, a more complex issue now in much of the country.
Yeah. So Tony, let me go back to you because you know this state very well. What we're seeing play out right now, and you and I have talked about this before. I think I spent the last 2 legislative voting cycles on the ground in Texas. I've seen a little bit of the fight and the animosity, but is this level of animosity between parties in Texas just the same thing that's been growing for a while? Or is this all about an awareness of how the stakes, not just in Texas, but nationwide, are at play here? What's going on and what's the feeling?
I think both of those things are true. What Democrats will tell you is that they had no choice, given the underlying facts of what is happening with redistricting, to take this to the national stage, to do exactly what they did, to put a bright red spotlight on this issue. But at the same time, many of them, in at least the earliest days of this battle, hoped that, for example, there could be some sort of compromise, that perhaps instead of 5 new districts, maybe there would be 2, maybe there would be 3. Of course, we know that with even in the early days of this battle, that possibility, that proposition went away. And what they say is that really even going into this, to your point, Chris, there was an underlying tension that was boiling higher than perhaps it ever has. They say that that really speaks to the deep political divide that exists not only in this state, but across the country. But they say that they did try to take steps to perhaps mend that divide, but that once it became very clear that was not going to happen, they had no choice but to do exactly what they did. But I can tell you the divide is loud and clear, not only taking place in these moments on the House floor, but also, Chris, in the Capitol Rotunda, where there are hundreds of people who have been chanting and protesting this morning what is happening here.
So tell me how they feel. I mean, do they feel as if they have any say, any power here? Look, what you'll hear from Republicans is that when you see this kind of protest, this is a relatively small group of people, especially in the state the size of Texas, who are left-wing rabble-rousers.
I've said this before, and I do think it's an important point that when I'm in an Uber talking to the Uber driver, or perhaps interacting with a more, average Texan who is not politically connected or deeply keeping up with this issue, frankly, they don't even know or fully comprehend or grasp what all is happening and what is at stake. But at the same time, when you see the number of people who are chanting, who have come here to the Capitol, it is a reminder that there is a vocal group that deeply cares. They see this as a fundamental threat to democracy. And if you ask them, they say, we don't care if we're 12 strong or 200 strong or 2,000 strong. The issue here is one that absolutely is fueling the degree of their response that they say is so necessary to preserve, again, what they say is democracy in the United States.